The movie begins showing an anonymous boy who lived in a slum in Poland. Therefore, let's just call him Thomas. Even though this boy looked arrogant, he was born in a good family and they really adhered to religious values. Unfortunately, Thomas lived in a bad neighborhood full of thugs. Because of that, he grew up with a different character from his family. Apart from that, he also had very high adrenaline hormones, which made him like to fist fight. Due to Thomas' actions, the school often called Thomas's father, and as a parent, Thomas's father could only apologize for his son's behavior. Because it happened repeatedly, the principal finally gave Thomas a final warning, but Thomas' mischief was not only in fist fights, he also often drove his father's taxi to get around the city with his friends. One night, Thomas saw a group of gangsters together with a call girl, and Thomas was immediately amazed, which made him inspired to become a gangster. 7 years later, Thomas grew into a naughty teenager who liked to play around. When his house was empty, Thomas liked to invite a woman to his house. That day, after having fun with a woman, Thomas' wild idea emerged. Thomas invited this woman to start an illegal business, which is a prostitution. The woman immediately agreed with Thomas' ideas. Unexpectedly, their illegal business was growing well and made Thomas crazy rich at his young age. In fact, he got customers from various circles, including an Arabian man who once took his father's taxi. Wanting to give a commission, Thomas went into his father's room in the middle of the night and slipped in the money from his business secretly, because if his father and his family found out, they would definitely be very disappointed in him. However, Thomas didn't realize that his father had started to become suspicious of his movements, and one night an incident occurred because of the Arabian man. When Thomas was beating the man, he was surprised because his father suddenly entered the room. Afraid of being discovered, Thomas reasoned that this Arabian man had hurt his friend. Unexpectedly, his father actually believed him, even though the reason didn't make sense. Thomas's father even offered a ride and took the woman home. Then, when his father was leaving, Thomas accidentally saw the Arab man's suitcase, which contained hundreds of dollars in cash. Seeing that, Thomas immediately took the money away. But apparently, the man had henchmen who succeeded in cornering Thomas. Finally, Thomas pretended to return the suitcase, but suddenly he attacked them all. After beating them all, Thomas saw up towards the bridge, and there was a boy who witnessed his brutality. It seemed that the boy also had a reckless soul like him. 12 years later, in 1996, Thomas became increasingly famous in the underground world, and he was recruited by a gang then appointed as deputy head of the mafia. Apart from that, long-haired Thomas made him look even more fierce. One day, Thomas was summoned by his boss, Maggie, a mafia who was known to be the most ruthless and cruel in Poland. In his boss's room, Thomas proposed the idea of robbing the entire salary of postmen, which amounted to 15 million zloty. Not only that, Thomas also asked his boss to send 5 armed troops to carry out the mission. Maggie immediately agreed to the plan, as long as this mission was led by Crowbar, one of the robbery experts in the gang. The next day, Thomas met Crowbar at a gym to plan the robbery. Crowbar also involved his younger brother, Crowbat. Without wasting any more time, Thomas immediately called all his men, then he handed over the strategy to Crowbar. After drawing up the plan, Crowbar asked his brother and Thomas to take the weapons from his trusted man. But as the deputy head of the mafia, Thomas didn't want to do such a trivial duty, especially because Crowbar's brother was too fussy, so Thomas told him to take the weapon alone. Then, not long after, Thomas started to get bored of waiting for a weapon. Therefore, he was spending his free time beating up local gangsters. Long story short, the robbery operation started. They wore masks and dressed in black. Without waiting any longer, they immediately intercepted the car which carried the money. That evening, Thomas immediately celebrated his success by drinking at a nightclub. Not long after, a waiter approached him, and it turned out that he was a kid who had witnessed Thomas's brutality 12 years ago. The waiter then introduced himself and said that his name is Walden. He also said he wanted to be a gangster like Thomas. A few days later, the police raided Thomas' house and arrested him right away. However, who would have thought that the police arrested him not because of a robbery charge, but because of a fight with a gangster? Because of that, Thomas only got 18 months in prison. Meanwhile, Maggie, Crowbar, and everyone involved in the robbery were also arrested, and of course they would be imprisoned for more than 7 years. Shortly, 18 months later, Thomas finally got out of prison, but instead of repenting, he actually intended to form his own gangster. The first thing he did was go to the dog farm, because in Poland, there is a belief that someone should save a lame puppy. Then it will be loyal to its master for the rest of its life. That's why Thomas adopted a disabled dog, which he hopes will be a symbol of his success. After that, Thomas met Walden and invited him to join his new gang, and while walking with him, Thomas was suddenly blocked by several gangsters. Seeing this, Walden immediately defended Thomas. However, it turned out that this incident was just a play to test Walden's loyalty, and all the gangsters were Thomas' men. Thanks to his courage, Walden was declared to have passed the test. In this way, the criminal gang that Thomas wanted was formed, and he already had 4 members. They were Walden, Crater, Thousand, and Gollum. After that, they immediately planned their crime to rob an expensive painting. Without waiting any longer, they immediately broke into the house of the rich man who kept the painting. But in the middle of the mission, Thomas saw a photo of a beautiful woman, which made him interested. Therefore, apart from stealing the expensive painting, he also took the photo. The next day, Thomas looked for information about the woman in the photo, and after investigating, it turned out that her name was Magda, a student who studied at the nearby campus. Thomas, who was obsessed with the girl, decided to pretend to be a student in order to meet her. During the class, Thomas's gaze was fixated on Magda's beauty, which made the lecturer angry and immediately asked Thomas. As someone who had never studied in a college, Thomas answered the question carelessly. When Thomas came home from campus, he met Crowbud, who should have been sentenced to 7 years in prison. Here, Thomas started to realize that Crowbud was the one who reported the robbery. Thomas, who was angry, pushed him into a pile of rubbish. That night, Thomas and Walden went to the bar to meet the woman he liked. But unfortunately, she came with a man, so Thomas secretly stole the man's wallet so that he had time to talk to Magda. Not long after, the man realized what Thomas did, but when he was about to separate the gangster with Magda, Walden immediately blocked and threatened him. Thanks to Walden's help, Thomas finally was able to spend time with Magda while playing billiards. Magda was curious about Thomas' job because he looked like a rich man, but here Thomas lied, claiming to be a successful businessman. He even claimed to have a big house, which has a large garden in his yard. But unfortunately, Magda was not easily fooled. Seeing that response, Thomas finally used all his charisma to convince her. And finally, Magda was moved and asked Thomas to stop by her house, and when they got there, they immediately made love and spent the rest of the night together. The next morning, Thomas came home from Magda's house with a very happy face. But on the way, he was suddenly intercepted and beaten by Crowbud and his men. After managing to escape, Thomas asked his men to hunt down Crowbud and his gang. Thomas was determined to make them get a reply. After that, Thomas met a man closest to Crowbud to track down Crowbud's whereabouts. But because he didn't get a satisfactory answer, Thomas ended up torturing this man. Then, while Thomas was busy torturing the man, he got a call from Magda, who wanted to visit Thomas's house. Before leaving the place, Thomas forced Crowbud's man to eat his own finger, which had been cut off. When he was satisfied with torturing the man, Thomas immediately looked for a big house with a garden, so that Magda would believe him and thought he's not lying. After looking for quite a long time, Thomas finally found a house belonging to a rich person that matched his wishes, and without talking much, he immediately bought the house. Since that day, Thomas and Magda decided to live together in that house until 2003. Here, Thomas had become a gangster boss who was much more successful than before. But of course, he still kept his job a secret from Magda and the parents. Then one night, when Thomas was preparing for dinner with the family, Walden came to show his cell phone. Walden brought important information regarding Crowbud's whereabouts. Thomas was very satisfied with Walden's performance and decided to give his luxury apartment to Walden. After having dinner with his family, Thomas's parents thought that their son had a small business. Because he felt sorry for his son, Thomas's father gave him his taxi so that Thomas could become a taxi driver to increase his income. But instead of using it to work and drive passengers, Thomas instead used the taxi to support his criminal operations, including catching one of Kraubot's men who had been hiding. When Thomas caught the man, he asked Walden to do the interrogation. However, because there was a new member, Walden ordered him to torture Kraubot's men until he revealed about the location of his boss. Unfortunately, their interrogation failed when a policeman came to the place, but who would have thought that Kraubot's man actually lied and said that he was just playing around with Thomas and the gang. Hearing this, Thomas praised the man and immediately told him to leave. One day, Thomas was visited by Marion, one of his friends who had just been released from prison after the robbery case in the past. Marion offered Thomas a job which could earn 500,000 zloty. Feeling interested, Thomas then invited Walden to visit Marion's base. There, the mafia ordered his man, Acid, to explain the job he was offering to Thomas. It turned out that they intended to rob a very rich breeder, but Thomas canceled their cooperation after hearing that Acid intended to kidnap the breeder's child. Even though Thomas was a gangster, he still had principles like the Yakuza. On the other hand, Walden was disappointed with the decision and begged his boss to cooperate with Marion. However, Thomas still didn't want to break his principle and would never involve a kid in his work. After being advised, Walden finally calmed down and didn't grumble anymore. One day, when he was robbing a painting, Thomas said that he would soon marry Magda and wanted to make the painting as a gift at his wedding. Hearing this, Thomas's men were also happy for him. Long story short, the long-awaited day finally arrived, but when Thomas was getting ready, he was surprised by a gift from Walden. It turned out to be Kraubot, who was already weak. After the wedding ceremony was done, Thomas and his men took Kraubot to an empty building, then interrogated him. Kraubot said that he just wanted to scare Thomas into collaborating in an illegal business. Even though it seemed trivial, Thomas would not forgive him, and without thinking twice, Thomas immediately tied Kraubot's neck like a dog and finished him off. That night, Thomas invited all the wedding guests to party in his yard. Here, Thomas was very grateful to have a beautiful wife. Not only that, he also was grateful for having brutal and trustworthy men. Unlike Thomas, who was increasingly successful, Marion was hunted down by his own men, causing the gang to split apart and become chaotic. Meanwhile, Thomas was on holiday at the beach with Magda, Walden, and his girlfriend. Here, Walden's girlfriend asked Magda whether she was not suspicious of Thomas' job, because as a taxi driver, he cannot possibly get rich in a short time. Magda just silently thought about what Walden's girlfriend said and began to suspect her husband. One night, Thomas and Walden went to a club to have a drink, but strangely, the club guard forbade them to enter just because they were wearing sneakers. Thomas didn't want any commotion, so he took Walden to another place. Of course, Walden was disappointed with Thomas's decision and felt that his boss was no longer excited since he got married. Hearing Walden's words, Thomas's adrenaline, which disappeared for a long time, suddenly came back. So without thinking twice, he immediately brutalized the club's guard without mercy. Walden was very happy because his boss returned to his violent mode again. Satisfied with the fist fight, Thomas got a call from a big mafia who wanted to work with him. The next day, Thomas visited a bookstore in the middle of the city, which is the base of the big mafia. Not long after, Thomas was invited in to meet with the mafia Daniel. However, Thomas was a little surprised when he saw Daniel's old appearance wearing a suit. Here, Daniel explained if he collaborated with the police to eradicate the violent gangsters who were disturbing the stability of Poland, because at that time, there were lots of gangsters disrupting the country and not benefiting the government. Meanwhile, the big mafias would not be bothered because they liked bribing the officials. The point was that Daniel wanted to invite Thomas to clean the city from gangsters for a very huge fee. Without thinking twice, Thomas accepted the offer and then mobilized his men to massacre all the gangsters. In short, Thomas and his gang have killed dozens of gangsters in a very short time, but Walden didn't seem satisfied and asked his boss to kill Daniel so he could take over the business. Hearing that, Thomas just kept quiet and looked disappointed because he had a greedy man. When Thomas was about to go home, a policeman came and wanted to invite him to cooperate. The policeman then asked Thomas to provide information regarding a gang called Loonies. But Thomas refused in order to maintain his principle. He didn't want to divulge information about other gangs. On the other hand, Magda was seen looking for a can in the kitchen, but she accidentally found a suitcase on top of the cupboard. Out of curiosity, she opened the suitcase and was shocked after seeing a lot of money in it. Even though all this time, she thought that her husband only worked as a taxi driver. Not long after, Thomas came home and was shocked when he saw his suitcase was in the garage. He went straight to his wife to discuss the suitcase. But strangely, Magda didn't want to talk about it. In another place, Daniel was very happy because of Thomas and his gang's performance, so he called Thomas to his base again and gave him 2 more missions. The point was that Thomas had to eliminate the Loonies gang and then supervise the process of sending 500 kilograms of narcotics. If Thomas was successful, Daniel would retire and hand over the throne of the mafia to him. But for some reason, Thomas didn't immediately accept the offer. After returning from Daniel's headquarters, Thomas was surprised by the arrival of his men, and it turned out that they had come carrying Walden, who was covered in blood. Magda, who didn't know anything, was afraid and chose to go into her room. Meanwhile, Thomas ordered his men to treat Walden's wound. After treating Walden, Thomas asked him what really happened, and Walden answered that he was shot by the police while carrying out illegal things. It means Thomas had to prepare himself because the police would definitely target him. The next day, Thomas chose to stay at home and read a book in silence while waiting for the police to arrive. But again, a surprising thing happened, because Thomas was arrested not because of Walden's actions, but because there was a statue of an Egyptian god in his house that was left behind by the previous owner. It turned out that this object was stolen from a museum. When Thomas arrived at the cell, he met the prisoners who looked at him sarcastically. As a result, Thomas immediately beat the ruler in the cell. From that day on, Thomas officially became the new ruler, and no one dared to disturb him. 2 months later, Walden visited Thomas. When Thomas was about to meet Walden, a warden sent by Daniel gave a message, saying Thomas had to persuade Walden not to disturb his business. In the visiting room, Thomas was shocked when he saw the change in his right-hand man, who became arrogant and greedy. Thomas then asked Walden to take a break from gangster affairs and stay away from Daniel's business. But unfortunately, Walden didn't listen to those words at all, and he instead said that he would steal the mafia's narcotics. Thomas wanted to stop Walden, so he thought of ways to get out of prison, until finally he ordered Gollum to meet the first owner of the house. Gollum immediately gave money to the previous owners of the house to testify in court, and said that the Egyptian statue there belonged to them. Long story short, Thomas was declared innocent and officially released from prison. Not only that, he was also greeted by Magda, who was pregnant. Unfortunately, Thomas's efforts were a little bit late, because Walden had already started his action by killing Daniel's men using a sniper. However, Daniel was lucky because the shot didn't hit him. Daniel, who was scared, decided to call Thomas to his place. There, this mafia had captured and tortured one of Walden's henchmen. Thomas then took a gun and immediately killed the man. After that, Thomas said to Daniel that he would handle Walden himself, and without wasting any time, Thomas started looking for information about the whereabouts of his favorite man. But on the other hand, Daniel sent one of his men to monitor Thomas's movements. At the same time, Walden was actually getting drunk at a hotel. He was so drunk and hallucinated seeing a giant spider in his room. That night, Thomas came to see Acid, who was enjoying watching a movie, and without further ado, Thomas pointed a gun while asking where Walden was. Because he was afraid, Acid finally told Thomas about Walden's location. After getting the information, Thomas decided to finish off Acid. Thomas immediately went to the location mentioned by Acid and killed Walden's friends. Thomas tried to persuade Walden to return to the way he was before, but Walden's ambition could no longer be subsided. Apart from that, he also no longer adhered to the principles which Thomas had taught during when they were in the same gang. So, like it or not, Thomas was forced to finish him off. After that, Thomas told Walden's girlfriend about her boyfriend's death. Not long after, Daniel came to pick Thomas to complete the mission which had been delayed. Thomas had to secure the delivery process of 500 kilograms of narcotics. After driving for quite a long time, The two of them finally arrived at a container full of drugs, but unfortunately, the police suddenly surrounded the container and they ran as far as possible. In the hiding place, Thomas looked very angry because he felt trapped by Daniel. He also suspected that the mafia intended to finish him off, but Daniel ignored his words. Soon after that, black smoke appeared in the sky. Suddenly, Daniel was shocked and immediately checked his drugs. Meanwhile, Thomas ran in the opposite direction while smiling, and it turned out that all this time he had been deceiving the mafia. In fact, he only pretended to kill Walden. Not only did he trick Daniel, he also managed to steal all of Daniel's drugs. When the mafia was lamenting that his business had been destroyed, Thomas went to see his subordinates and said goodbye while giving 3 large bags containing drug packages as a thank you. After that, Thomas would go out of town by ship, and it turned out that the captain of the ship was Crowbut's man, whom he had let go because he didn't tell the police. On his journey, Thomas invited Magda, Walden, and also his girlfriend. After waiting for a long time, Walden finally woke up from his fainting, and of course, he was very shocked because he was already on a ship. Apart from that, Walden wanted to return to Poland because he still has a dream of becoming a ruler there. Thomas, who was fed up, immediately pointed his gun. Walden said that he was always loyal to Thomas' side. He even killed a kid who saw his gang's actions, so that they wouldn't be reported to the police. Hearing that, Thomas suddenly vomited because he couldn't bear to hear the fact that his subordinates killed a kid to protect the gang. While his boss was still vomiting, Walden chose to use drugs, and he breathed his last breath. Thomas immediately burst into tears and felt guilty. Magda and Walden's girlfriend also felt sad. After Walden's death, Thomas was determined to become a better gangster. Years later, Thomas was again in prison, but this time he was in prison for burning half a ton of drugs to prevent it from entering Polish territory. He did all this because he didn't want to let the youths have a bad future. Apart from sacrificing himself for the good of others, Thomas also wrote a book entitled The White-Eyed Man, which shocked the entire country because he exposed the rottenness of all the mafia in Poland. Then the film ended.